It feels inadequate to describe Alice Munro as one of our great writers. Some of Canada's most accomplished authors describe Alice as their North Star. She has won everything from the Booker Prize to the Nobel Prize. Today on the podcast, we celebrate everything that Alice Munro gave us. I'm Elamin Abdul-Mahmoud. This is Commotion. Look, the legacy of Alice Munro, I think, so vast that it might be impossible to describe. So let's just start in the simplest, most direct way possible, because that's what Alice Munro would want us to do. Alice Munro was a writer of short stories. Her stage was small-town Canada, and her characters had what book critics called ordinary lives and ordinary jobs. But Alice didn't see it that way.
I don't know who the ordinary people are, because everyone is extraordinary to themselves. I read one review that said these people don't have any extraordinary experiences. They're civil servants, farmers, accountants, nurses. Well, nurses have about the most dramatic life I can think of. And I don't know. It's probably that I don't write about, secret agents? Or people who have psychic experiences or something like this. But I never consider these people ordinary. But then I never meet anybody I do consider ordinary.
Alice grew up in Wingham, a small hamlet in Ontario, in a family that, according to her, didn't really encourage reading, but she had a natural appetite for books that only kept growing. She published her first book of her short stories, Dance of the Happy Shades, in her late 30s, and then went on to publish 13 more books, including Who Do You Think You Are?, Lives of Girls and Women, and Runaway. She also frequently contributed fiction to The New Yorker. Alice won every major literary award this country has to offer, and then she went overseas, right? She won so many significant international prizes, like the Booker Prize, like the Nobel Prize for Literature. Alice Munro died on Monday. She was 92 years old. Joining me to celebrate her legacy, which goes far beyond this country's borders, is her longtime publisher, Douglas Gibson, and writers Heather O'Neill and Madeleine Thien. Welcome, everybody. I'm so grateful that you're here. Thank you for being here.
Pleasure. Great to be here.
Let me begin by saying my condolences, and also I want to start off with this interview with Alice Munro, where she talks about her path to becoming a writer. Take a listen.
At first, when I was about 8, I planned to be a movie star, and this continued for 2 or 3 years. And so then I sort of slipped into writing, a slightly downgrade, because being a movie star would be more wonderful. But no, I wanted to make up stories, and I was making up stories in my head. And by the time I was about 11, I really thought that I had to write them down. That was what you did with stories. You didn't just let them fade, you wrote them. And it was not even the thought of other people reading them, but that the book, that there would be a book with your story in it, the thing itself. And it really never occurred to me until much later, when I was around 30, that I might not be able to do this. So the confidence lasted for a long time.
It was lovely watching all of your smiles as you were listening to that clip from Alice Munro. That was Alice Munro on the CBC in 2004. Douglas, you worked with Alice very closely for years and years. What went through your mind when you heard that she was gone?
Well, I'm a tough Scot, so I'm not given to emotional reactions. But I found that the news of Alice's death left me no longer dry-eyed. And I was stunned by how we'd all lost a great writer, and I had lost a friend. So the world was suddenly a much poorer place.
Douglas, can I ask you, why did you love her work? What did you love about it?
It was always so full of life, full of interesting characters, everyday people in fascinating and believable situations. She took these ordinary people and made them into international characters. And that is why the Alice Munro name is compared to today to Chekhov and other major international literary figures.
Mm-hmm. Heather, can I ask you, you recently reread all of Alice's books. What's your experience with her work now, would you say, compared to maybe reading them when you were a university student?
Oh, it was so different. Yeah, I was sick, and then I just had to cancel a trip to Paris, and then it just came upon me that I wanted to reread Alice Munro because it had been 30 years since I had read some of the stories. And what was so funny for me in rereading them now was that when I was young, a lot of them I thought they were stories about young girls in the 50s and 60s, and I was a fool because I thought those were things that women went through back then, and that somehow I had more freedom and agency than these women. And then reading them now, I just realized how contemporary it is and how radical it was, these women who are putting themselves first, and how much in my life I had experienced similar to the characters. When you're a woman and you try, everybody just is always up in your space, trying to make you a caregiver, trying to take your time, and what a battle it is to live your own story, and how outraged anyone gets when a woman says, I want to do this because I want to.
Mm-hmm. I want to come back to all of those themes that you just mentioned in just a moment, but maybe I'll go to you, Madeleine. Your first book, Simple Recipes, was blurbed by Alice Munro. This is a genuinely rare honor. You met her a couple of times. What do you remember about the first time meeting her?
Yes, I think the first time I met her, I was yet to publish a book. I think Doug Gibson, you might have been there. It was a launch for the New Canadian Library.
Yes.
And Guy Vanderhaeg brought me up to Alice Munro, and he said, Alice, I need you to meet your biggest fan. I was 24. Oh, I'm going to get emotional. I couldn't speak. I was totally speechless. I just could not. She took one look at me in her Alice way. She understood everything. And she launched into a long story about a cookbook she'd recently acquired that makes use of canned meat spam. And then we had a very long conversation about spam. And I loved her.
That's beautiful. That's really beautiful. Madeleine, Alice didn't have this typical sort of easy path to becoming a writer. You know, she grew up in a small Ontario town, in a family that discouraged reading. She started university, had to drop out a couple of years later because she couldn't afford tuition. She published her first book relatively late compared to a lot of other people. You know, she was around 37 years old when she did. It feels like, you know, she brings many of these elements to her work. Small towns, womanhood, marriage, motherhood, aging. What do you think inspires you about the way that she approached her career and brought her life into her work, do you think?
There's a couple things. I think when I first started reading her, for me, I felt like I recognized my mother's life. My mother's born in Hong Kong, totally different, maybe trajectory. But there was something about desire, change, even wanting to flee one's own life. I think some of us are the children of those who fled. And in Alice Munro, we found our mothers in different ways, or even ourselves as time went on. And I think what has moved me so much about her writing life is it's clear her devotion has been to the story and the constant shifting question of what the story really is. And it wasn't, her devotion wasn't to be a writer in the world. Her devotion was to know what the story is. And I think she's definitely a light for all of us.
Mm-hmm. So we were talking about how Alice grew up in Wingham, Ontario, and we've talked about, small towns are sort of prominent parts of her books. Some critics had the nerve to refer to her as a regional writer. And they didn't mean this as a compliment. Here's how she felt about that.
I don't like to be described as a regional writer, because I'm seen as someone who writes about small towns in the country. It almost seems to me by accident that I write about those people. It's because I know their houses and I know certain things about their lives, but I don't think of them as particularly different from people you might find anywhere in the world. It's just something I do without thinking about it.
Heather, what do you make of this branding, this sort of label that some people try to put on her as a regional writer?
Oh, people have always tried to pigeonhole her, particularly as a woman writer, as though she has domestic issues that aren't important in
Mm.
a small town. But it's such a lie. And because the more specific one is as a writer, that's how one finds universality.
Mm.
And the idea that she went into these backyards and found all the dramas of Shakespeare is so wonderful. The poetry, and even as growing up as a Canadian writer, the idea that one could find the fables and the stories of the world in our own environment.
Mm.
It's such a freedom. And the idea of we always try and make this the universal writer is some male out in Paris or whatever. It's always somebody who's not, he's not, who just keeps everybody out of literature. And that's not what literature is about. It is about making all these particular experiences, the tiniest, details, strange place to show that we all have these common desires.
Mm. Douglas, we hear all these stories about Alice having this reputation for being a ruthless sort of revisionist. You hear this all the time. Sometimes she would be asked to do a reading, and she would say, "I can't do that. And the reason I can't is because if I open it, I will just want to revise everything that there is in front of me." I heard that she actually literally stopped the presses once. Can you tell us that story about literally stopping the presses?
Yeah, I will never forget this.
I can imagine.
You can imagine that this was a very big deal for us. I was then at Macmillan of Canada, and we were thrilled to have this major new book coming out, and it was coming out. It was literally at the printer. And then I got a phone call at home from Alice, and this was a Saturday, and she began with her usual politeness about, she described it as country manners. And we talked about this and that, and then she said, "How is this new book coming along?" And I said, "Oh, great news there, Alice. It's at the printers, and we'll be getting finished copies next week." And she said, "Well, that's too bad, because I like to revise the whole second half." And I wonder if we could do that and still bring the book out. And I was horrified, as you can imagine. And so we arranged that she would come in from Clinton,
Mm-hmm.
and we would discuss it. And I had my bosses there, and it was an important event. And to my horror, at the end of the morning, it was decided that I would read the new version plus news story.
Yeah.
And then we would meet early in the afternoon and make the decision. And making the decision was worth, if we agreed to it, it meant redoing the whole second half of the book. So I read it over lunch, and then we all got together, and I said, "Alice is right. It is better this way." And the typesetters were so thrilled by this historic high drama that in the end we only lost about 10 days of selling time, and the book indeed came out with the second half entirely changed, thanks to Alice and thanks to my bosses who thought it was great to have me as the troublemaking decision maker.
Yeah, I can only imagine. I can only imagine the idea of Alice Munro saying, "It's too bad because we really got to redo the second half." And then you read it and you go, "Well, turns out Alice was right this whole time," because that is no small undertaking. Very few other writers could literally get their press to stop. That is an incredible story. Heather, I want to say, one of Alice's most famous books, Lives of Girls and Women, was banned from the high school reading list in Huron County, where she grew up. This is back in 1979. I want you to hear Alice talking to the CBC about it.
They somehow think that if we don't write about sex, it will disappear, it will go away. They talk about preserving their 17-year-old and 18-year-old children, and protecting them. Well, biology doesn't protect them.
Heather, I was just reading the piece that you just wrote for the Start. People think of Alice Munro as a writer of the mundane, but we don't really talk about the way that she wrote about sex. Talk to me about the way that she wrote about women and pleasure and impulse and people who find themselves in situations where they just are so pulled to doing something and then later going, should I really have been doing that?
Yeah, I understand why they would want to ban that book, because people don't want to admit that women have these desires, because if you admit that women have uncontrollable desire, this uncontainable urges, it means that you can tame women, you can control them, but they have this unpredictable quality and I love in her stories how sexuality and desire is almost this evil genius in women that just destroys their lives. And you watch them make these decisions, and they're so strange to watch them make the desire. And actually, she has this one story where a character decides she's going to cheat on her husband. So she goes to have the affair, but the man she wants to have the affair with rejects her. So she just goes home and tells her husband she had the affair anyway, so that he throws her out. And then also, every time there's a train, every time an Alice Munro character gets on a train, I'm like, here we go. Because there's this association with desire and getting away from the family in motion, and just moving away from her family and going someplace. It just turns the characters on and makes them wild. And I just absolutely adore that about her character. And people don't actually talk about that, because you think, oh, it's small town women, they're all so dainty, but it's like, there is some wild sex in those stories.
Yeah. I really love the way that you described all of the train scenes, and you described several of them in your Toronto Star piece, because you kind of put them all together. Madeleine, what strikes you about the way that Alice Munro wrote about women?
I agree with so much of what Heather says, and I think that it's not just about the sexual act. It is that, and it is the way that sexual act is remembered across time, as the breaking down of something, as the self-revealing itself to itself. And I think there's one line where she talks about this betrayal, this affair that is obscene. And enthralling and unbearable, all those things at once. My sense is that she saw women clearly. I think that's one of the powerful things of why the work is lasting and will last a very long time. She is that writer who, through artifice, knew truth. And I think that's why we recognize it as we age, from generation to generation. It must have been hard to see so clearly also. But she gave us such pleasure. There's that line she says that the continuous happiness is curiosity. And she gave us a lot.
Yeah, it's like she takes a magnifying glass to these moments of change in a life. And in that magnifying glass, it's like a globe, a whole entire world. And when you come out I'm always so overwhelmed when I finish one of her stories
Mm-hmm.
because I'm like, I just lived another life
Mm-hmm.
and I have to just sit.
I was thinking about this yesterday because I was rereading The Bear Came Over the Mountain, which is
Mm.
a story that Sarah Polley ended up adapting to become the movie away from her, of course, with the great Gordon Pinsent. And as I was reading the story, I was sort of like trying to pay attention to what's happening in my body, Heather, and like there was like it was like the tension was building, but not a lot was happening in the plot. And I was trying to figure out what it is about Alice Munro's writing that sort of does that to you. And it is, to me, it's about the level of the level of precision in terms of describing not just an action but an emotion, and so plainly. I mean, I don't mean plainly as in like basically. I mean plainly as in like it's always just like seen so clearly, like this moment that describes sort of everything. How do you begin to sort of describe to somebody what Alice Munro does to you as you're reading her work, Heather?
It's Yeah, she plays with time. She slows it down for those moments.
Mm-hmm.
And she finds the moments of crossroads that in life you don't realize they were a crossroad until later.
Mm-hmm.
And so she finds that moment when these small decisions, whether it's an affair, a decision to move, anything that just unravels everything. And then then she speeds it up and you watch the unraveling. And it's this tremendous effect. Nobody else can do it. It's magical the way she plays with time, and she makes life. She just takes a life and like an accordion, she makes it larger and then smaller and then larger. And a lot of times as a writer, when I read, I just study the craft. But with Alice Munro, I'm just like, I let her do it because nobody else can do it that way.
Truly, she will spend a page, on the way a character might hang a towel and how that is descriptive of everything about them. And then by the end of the page, we have fast forwarded 40 years, and you don't need to know anything else aside from that little detail, aside from that moment that sort of reveals everything. Madeleine, as we sort of like begin to wrap up our conversation here, how are you thinking about Alice Munro's legacy?
Wow, that is the big question, isn't it? I think as a writer, she is our literary mother. I think that our generation grew up in that blossoming, not of that her work blossomed, but the blossoming of appreciation for her work really marks my 20s all the way to the present. I believe she got to some purity of language in which real and living lives could exist in this vessel. I think she has an amazing memory for the things she saw and the world in which she came of age, in which she observed in these incredible 90-something years.
That is a really beautiful description and a really beautiful place to put it. I want to say thank you to all of you, Madeleine, Thien, Douglas Gibson, Heather O'Neill. Thank you for being here to remember that everything that Alice Munro gave us. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Douglas Gibson worked closely with Alice Munro as her publisher and editor for many, many years. He's written a book called Stories About Storytellers. Heather O'Neill is a Montreal novelist whose books include When We Lost Our Heads, Lullabies with Little Criminals, and the forthcoming book, The Capital of Dreams. And Madeleine Thien is a Canadian novelist currently based in Brooklyn, New York. Her books include Simple Recipes and Do Not Say We Have Nothing. You can hear archival interviews with Alice Munro this week on The Next Chapter and Writers and Company. That is it for the show today. Look, if I can just leave you with this, I just recommend you find any Alice Munro short story and immerse yourself in that world, and you will see exactly the thing that we've been talking about today. My name is Elamin Abdul Mahmoud. This show is called Commotion. We're going to be back tomorrow. I will see you then.